July 28, 1943, 28,000 feet above Hamburg, Oberleutnant Werner Hoffmann felt the familiar cold sweat beneath his flight suit as 374 American B-17 flying fortresses filled the sky like a mechanical plague. This wasn't the scattered chaos of RAF night raids, where darkness offered sanctuary and cunning could save you. This was broad daylight mathematics, a geometric nightmare of overlapping fields of fire that transformed each bomber into a flying fortress indeed. His earphones crackled with the voice of his wingman, 21-year-old Feldwebel Klaus Richter, who had survived exactly 4 combat missions. Staffelkapitän, there are so many. How do we approach without being torn apart? Hoffmann had no answer that wouldn't sound like a death sentence. For 2 years, Luftwaffe pilots had dominated European skies, but the American daylight formations represented something entirely different from anything they had and encountered. These weren't individual bombers scattered across the night sky, vulnerable to lonely hunters. These were flying battle wagons, arranged in combat boxes specifically designed to create killing zones where German fighters would be shredded by coordinated defensive fire. What Hoffmann and thousands of Luftwaffe pilots were discovering that summer morning was a tactical revolution that would fundamentally transform aerial warfare. The Americans had solved a problem the Germans never believed could be solved: how to defend bombers in daylight through formation discipline, defensive firepower, and ruthless mathematical precision. Within 18 months, this defensive system would cost the Luftwaffe more experienced pilots than the entire Eastern Front, destroy the invincibility myth that had sustained German fighter forces since 1939, and create a psychological trauma so profound that veteran pilots would volunteer for ground combat rather than face another American formation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fear Luftwaffe pilots developed toward American daylight formations didn't emerge from cowardice, but from cold mathematical reality. RAF Bomber Command's night raids, while devastating to German cities, offered German pilots distinct tactical advantages. Darkness provided concealment. A skilled night fighter pilot could stalk individual bombers, use cloud cover and darkness for approach, strike from below where defensive guns had limited fields of fire, and escape before other bombers even knew an attack had occurred. The Kammhuber line, Germany's elaborate night fighter defense system, had developed into a sophisticated art form by 1943. Pilots like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who would eventually claim 121 night victories, and Helmut Lent with 113 victories, had refined techniques that made them extraordinarily effective against individual bombers in darkness. These men were hunters in the truest sense, patient, calculating, exploiting every advantage that night operations provided. Major Wilhelm Jonnen, who flew 133 night missions and achieved 34 confirmed victories, described the psychology of night fighting in his post-war memoir. Against the British at night, I was a predator. I controlled the engagement. I chose when to attack, from what angle, when to break off. The darkness was my ally. I could see the bomber silhouetted against searchlights or fires below, but he couldn't see me until my cannons fired. Even then, I could disappear into the night before his gunners could respond effectively. But American daylight formations destroyed every advantage that night fighting provided. First, there was no concealment. Every attacking fighter was visible to dozens of gunners, simultaneously from the moment it approached within effective range. Second, the combat box formation created overlapping fields of fire that eliminated safe approach angles. Third, American gunners were trained to coordinate their defensive fire, creating a concentrated barrage that would track attacking fighters throughout their attack run. Fourth, and perhaps most psychologically devastating, German pilots had to press their attacks knowing they were flying into a mathematical certainty of being hit. The combat box formation that American bomber groups employed by mid-1943 represented years of tactical development and brutal learning experiences. The formation wasn't accidental or intuitive. It was engineered specifically to maximize defensive firepower while maintaining bombing accuracy. A typical combat box consisted of 18 to 21 bombers arranged in a three-dimensional formation. Lead squadron flew at the formation's base altitude. High squadron, positioned 1,000 feet above and to the right, low squadron 1,000 feet below and to the left. Each bomber within the formation maintained precise spacing, close enough that their defensive guns created overlapping fields of fire, but far enough apart that German fighters couldn't rake multiple bombers with a single pass. The mathematics were brutal. Each B-17 carried 1350 caliber machine guns by 1943, the G model. With proper positioning, a single combat box of 21 bombers could bring 273 machine guns to bear on an attacking fighter, creating a cone of fire approximately 2,000 yards deep, where survival became statistically improbable. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commanding the 305th Bomb Group, had refined the combat box through experimentation and analysis of combat losses. His formations were tighter than previous arrangements, his defensive discipline more rigid, his results dramatically better. LeMay's group suffered significantly lower losses than other formations flying similar missions, not because his crews were braver or his aircraft better, but because his formations maximized defensive mathematics. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famous Memphis Belle, described the psychological impact of formation discipline. You flew so close to other bombers that you could see the faces of their waist gunners. You held formation regardless of flak, regardless of fighters, regardless of anything. Break formation and you were dead. The Germans learned quickly that any bomber falling out of formation was easy meat. So you held position even when every instinct screamed to take evasive action. The formation was your survival. Leave it and you were alone against fighters who had been hoping someone would panic. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The defensive firepower that American formations could generate shocked German pilots who had grown accustomed to the relatively light defensive armament of British bombers. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Jabs, who achieved 50 victories, including 16 four-engine bombers, described his first encounter with a full American combat box in August 1943. We approached from the rear quarter at 400 kilometers per hour, the standard attack profile that had worked against British bombers for 2 years. My wingman and I were experienced pilots with dozens of victories. We knew exactly how to execute a rear attack, close to 300 meters, fire a 3-second burst, break away beneath the bomber's tail. But as we closed to 400 meters, the entire formation seemed to explode with muzzle flashes. Tracers converged from bombers we weren't even targeting. I could see the streams of bullets, hundreds of them, creating a visible curtain of fire we had to fly through to reach our target. My wingman's aircraft took hits immediately. Pieces flew off his engine, cowling, his canopy shattered. He broke off trailing white smoke. I continued my attack because breaking off would have meant certain death. I was committed. My aircraft shuddered as rounds struck my wings and fuselage. I fired my cannons at the target bomber, saw strikes on his wing, then dove away as more tracers followed me down. I counted 11 separate holes in my aircraft after landing. My wingman didn't return. We had achieved nothing except proving these American formations were unlike anything we had faced before. German fighter tactics that had proven devastatingly effective against individual bombers became suicide missions against American combat boxes. The standard Luftwaffe approach for bomber interception involved attacking from the rear quarter, where most bombers had their weakest defensive armament. A skilled pilot would close rapidly to 300 meters or less, fire a concentrated burst at the bomber's wing root or engines, then break away before defensive gunners could respond effectively. This tactic worked brilliantly against isolated bombers. A single fighter attacking a single bomber had significant advantages: speed, maneuverability, initiative, and heavier armament. But the same attack against a combat box formation meant flying through concentrated fire from multiple bombers for 15 to 20 seconds while closing, maintaining a steady attack run for 3 to 5 seconds while firing, then breaking away through more concentrated fire. German pilots calculated they would be under fire from multiple guns for approximately 30 seconds per attack, 30 seconds, where a single hit from a 50 caliber round could destroy their aircraft or kill them instantly. Major Egon Meyer, who would eventually develop head-on attack tactics specifically to counter American formations and achieve 102 victories before his death in March 1944, described the psychological burden. Against the British at night, I controlled the engagement. I decided when to attack, when to break off, when to re-engage. Against American daylight formations, the bombers controlled the engagement. They maintained formation regardless of our attacks. Their discipline was extraordinary. I watched comrades die attacking these formations, not because they made mistakes, but because the mathematics were against them. You could execute a perfect attack run and still be shot down by coordinated defensive fire from bombers you weren't even targeting. This wasn't combat as we understood it. This was flying into a mechanical meat grinder and hoping you survived long enough to damage one bomber. The psychological impact of facing American formations manifested in ways that shocked Luftwaffe leadership. Pilots who had fearlessly engaged British night raiders and Soviet aircraft began developing psychosomatic symptoms before missions against American daylight raids. Medical officers reported increasing cases of nervous exhaustion, combat fatigue, and outright refusal to fly among experienced pilots. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a decorated fighter commander who survived the war with 176 victories, witnessed the psychological deterioration firsthand. I saw pilots with dozens of victories, men who had earned the Knight's Cross, break down before missions against American formations. These weren't cowards. These were experienced combat veterans who had proven their courage repeatedly. But the daylight formations created a unique psychological burden. You knew with mathematical certainty that attacking them meant flying through concentrated defensive fire. You knew that many of your comrades wouldn't return. You knew that even successful attacks often resulted in damage to your own aircraft. This wasn't the romanticized aerial combat of individual duels. This was industrial warfare, mechanical, impersonal, ruthlessly efficient. The Americans had essentially created a flying fortress in truth, not through armor or invincibility, but through disciplined formations that transformed individual vulnerable bombers into a collective defensive system far more formidable than the sum of its parts. What made this psychological burden even more crushing for German pilots was the contrast with their earlier experiences. From 1939 through 1942, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had enjoyed almost uncontested superiority over European skies. They had swept aside Polish, French, and British fighters with apparent ease. They had decimated Soviet air forces in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. They had developed an identity as an elite warrior class, technically superior, tactically brilliant, racially destined for dominance. The American daylight formations shattered this identity completely. The doctrine that had guided Luftwaffe fighter development emphasized individual pilot skill, aircraft maneuverability, and aggressive tactics. German pilots trained for aerial combat as individual warriors engaging in personal duels. The concept of fighting as a coordinated unit against a collective defensive system didn't exist in their tactical vocabulary. General Major Adolf Galland, General of Fighter Forces, had built the Luftwaffe fighter arm around the principle of offensive superiority. German fighters would achieve air superiority by shooting down enemy aircraft through superior pilot skill and aggressive tactics. The idea that bombers could defend themselves through formation discipline rather than requiring fighter escort challenged the fundamental assumptions of German air doctrine. When American formations first appeared over Europe in 1942, Luftwaffe commanders initially dismissed them as targets even easier than British night raiders. Bombers flying in daylight without significant fighter escort seemed like a gift. German intelligence calculated that bombers, no matter how well armed, couldn't possibly defend themselves against determined fighter attacks. The Americans, German planners believed, would suffer catastrophic losses and abandon daylight bombing within months. This assessment seemed validated by early results. The American 8th Air Force's first year of operations from England suffered significant losses. Individual raids lost 20 to 25% of attacking bombers. The mathematics seemed to favor Germany decisively, but what German analysts missed was that American losses, while painful, were sustainable given American industrial production and training capacity. More critically, German pilots were dying at rates that German training programs couldn't replace. Hauptmann Heinz Noack, who flew 452 combat missions and achieved 33 confirmed victories, kept a detailed diary that revealed the mounting psychological pressure. His entry from October 17, 1943, described a mission against American bombers near Aachen. We intercepted a formation of approximately 60 B-17s, flying in perfect combat boxes at 7,000 meters altitude. Our group of 40 fighters attacked from multiple angles simultaneously, hoping to overwhelm their defensive fire through sheer numbers. The sky filled with tracers, German cannon shells, and American 50 caliber rounds, creating a deadly lattice of fire. I watched Oberleutnant Weber's Follow 190 disintegrate under concentrated fire from multiple bombers. He was an experienced pilot with 18 victories. His error was attempting a textbook rear approach against the formation's trailing element. At least 6 bombers engaged him simultaneously. His aircraft simply came apart in mid-air. I pressed my own attack, firing at a bomber in the formation's high element. I saw strikes on his wing, possibly damaging one engine. Then tracers from other bombers forced me to break away. My wingman reported taking hits and had to abort the mission. We landed to discover our grupper had shot down 3 bombers confirmed, possibly 2 more damaged. We had lost 5 aircraft and 4 pilots killed, including 2 experienced formation leaders. The mathematics were insane. We were trading experienced pilots for bombers at a rate that would destroy the Jagdwaffe within months. The American gunners themselves developed into formidable opponents as they gained experience. Early in the bombing campaign, many American gunners were inadequately trained, firing at extreme ranges, wasting ammunition, and failing to coordinate their defensive fire effectively. But by mid-1943, American aerial gunnery schools were producing specialists who understood the mathematics of deflection shooting, the importance of fire discipline, and the value of coordinated defense. Staff Sergeant Benjamin Warmer, a waist gunner on a B-17 with the 91st Bomb Group, described the evolution of defensive gunnery techniques. My first missions, I was terrified and fired at anything within visual range, wasting ammunition and accomplishing nothing. But our group gunnery officer taught us systematic defensive fire. We learned to hold fire until fighters closed within 400 yards. We learned to track attacking fighters throughout their approach, following them with our gun barrels even when out of effective range. We learned to call out fighter positions using clock positions and altitude, coordinating our fire so multiple guns engaged each attacker. Most importantly, we learned that disciplined fire was more effective than panic fire. A 3-second burst of aimed fire at 300 yards would do more damage than 20 seconds of unaimed fire at 600 yards. The American emphasis on coordinated defensive fire created a multiplier effect that German pilots hadn't anticipated. A single bomber with 13 guns was a nuisance. A combat box of 21 bombers with 273 guns firing in coordinated patterns was a death trap. Technical Sergeant Michael Aruth, a top turret gunner who completed 35 missions with the 306th Bomb Group, claimed 5 confirmed fighter victories, described the psychological dynamic from the gunner's perspective. We knew the German pilots were scared of our formations. You could see it in how they attacked. Early in the war, they'd press attacks aggressively, closing to point-blank range. By late 1943, many fighters would fire from extreme range and break away without pressing their attacks. They were trying to disrupt our formation, hoping someone would panic and fall out of position. The moment a bomber left formation, he was doomed. We'd watch German fighters swarm isolated bombers like sharks sensing blood. But as long as we held formation, maintained our defensive discipline, we had a fighting chance. The formation was everything. It was our armor, our weapon, our survival. The mathematical reality of attacking American formations became clear through brutal empirical evidence accumulated over hundreds of missions. German fighter units maintained detailed records of combat encounters, and by late 1943, these records painted a devastating picture. Attacking a combat box formation required approximately 30 to 45 seconds of exposure to defensive fire. During this period, a single fighter would typically face concentrated fire from 6 to 12 bombers simultaneously, representing 78 to 156 50-caliber machine guns tracking a single aircraft. The probability of taking hits during a standard attack run approached 80% for fighters that pressed their attacks to effective range. The probability of catastrophic damage approached 35%. These weren't propaganda figures or pessimistic estimates. These were hard numbers derived from actual combat results, comparing sorties flown to aircraft damaged, pilots wounded, and fighters lost. Oberleutnant Günther Specht, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 11 and achieved 34 confirmed victories before his death in December 1943, compiled detailed statistical analyses of his unit's combat performance. His report to Luftwaffe headquarters in November 1943 documented the crisis with unsparing clarity. My Geschwader flew 216 combat sorties against American heavy bomber formations during October 1943. We achieved 41 confirmed bomber destructions and approximately 60 additional bombers damaged to varying degrees. This represents our most successful month against American formations. However, these victories cost us 38 fighters destroyed, 52 fighters damaged, requiring major repair, 19 pilots killed, 14 pilots wounded seriously, enough to be removed from combat status, and 7 pilots missing, presumed dead. We are trading experienced pilots and irreplaceable aircraft for bombers at a rate of approximately 1.8 to 1. The Americans can sustain these losses indefinitely through their industrial production. We cannot. At current attrition rates, my Geschwader will cease to exist as an effective fighting force within 4 months. What made the American formation tactics even more devastating was their systematic nature. This wasn't improvised defense or lucky survival. This was engineered warfare, methodically designed to maximize American advantages while exploiting German weaknesses. The Americans had studied German attack tactics meticulously, analyzed gun camera footage, interviewed returning crews, and continuously refined their formations to counter evolving German tactics. When German pilots began attacking from head-on to reduce their exposure time to defensive fire, American formations added chin turrets to B-17G models, specifically to counter frontal attacks. When German fighters attempted to stand off at long range and fire rockets, American formations tightened their spacing to present smaller target profiles and make rocket accuracy nearly impossible. When German pilots tried diving attacks from high altitude to maximize speed through the defensive fire zone, American formations adjusted their vertical spacing to maintain overlapping fields of fire at all altitudes. Every German tactical innovation met a systematic American counter-innovation, creating an evolutionary arms race that Germany was losing because American industrial capacity and training systems could iterate faster than German tactical development. Major Heinz Bahr, who survived the war with 220 victories and flew against American formations extensively, reflected on this dynamic in post-war interviews. The Americans fought scientifically. They analyzed every engagement, identified weaknesses in their formations, and corrected them systematically. We fought intuitively, relying on individual pilot skill and aggressive spirit. Against scattered opponents, our approach was superior. Against a systematically designed defensive system, backed by unlimited industrial resources, our approach was suicide. By late 1943, attacking American formations felt like attacking a machine. The formations didn't panic, didn't break, didn't respond emotionally. They simply maintained their discipline and let their defensive mathematics grind us down. The contrast with RAF night bombing operations couldn't have been more stark, and German pilots recognized this distinction with painful clarity. Flying against RAF Bomber Command at night offered German pilots opportunities for individual heroism, tactical creativity, and reasonable survival odds. A skilled night fighter pilot could achieve multiple victories in a single mission, stalking individual bombers through darkness, executing calculated attacks, and escaping before coordinated defense could respond. Night fighting had a personal quality that appealed to the warrior ethos German pilots had been trained to embrace. Hauptmann Wilhelm Jonen described the fundamental psychological difference in his post-war memoir. Against RAF night raids, I was hunting. I used my radar operator's skill, my own experience, weather conditions, and tactical creativity to find and destroy individual bombers. Each victory felt personal, earned through skill and cunning. I ended the war with 34 confirmed night victories and felt pride in each one. But during the handful of daylight missions I flew against American formations, I felt like an industrial worker, not a warrior. I was executing a mechanical process, approach formation, accept damage while attempting to damage one bomber, break away, land, repair damage, repeat. There was no creativity, no individual triumph, just mathematics and attrition. I volunteered to remain exclusively on night fighter duties because I couldn't psychologically accept the daylight missions. I wasn't alone. Many experienced pilots specifically requested night fighter assignments to avoid American daylight formations. The psychological refuge that night fighting provided became increasingly important as the daylight bombing campaign intensified. Night missions offered German pilots a chance to feel competent, effective, skilled. They could achieve victories, earn decorations, maintain their self-image as elite warriors. Daylight missions against American formations offered only the certainty of flying into concentrated defensive fire, watching comrades die, and feeling powerless against an enemy that didn't fight by the romantic rules of individual aerial combat. The training backgrounds of American bomber gunners contributed significantly to their effectiveness, though this advantage took time to develop. Early American gunners in 1942 and early 1943 often received minimal training, sometimes as little as 3 to 4 weeks of basic gunnery instruction. These crews suffered accordingly, firing ineffectively, wasting ammunition, and failing to coordinate their defensive fire. But by mid-1943, American aerial gunnery schools had evolved into sophisticated training operations that produced genuinely dangerous gunners. Trainees spent weeks learning ballistics, deflection shooting, aircraft identification, gun maintenance, and emergency procedures. They practiced on ranges that simulated combat conditions, firing at towed targets from moving platforms that replicated bomber motion. Advanced training included coordination exercises, where multiple gunners practiced engaging simulated fighters from a stationary mock-up fuselage, learning to call out targets, avoid crossing streams of fire, and maintain fire discipline. Staff Sergeant Robert Schowens, who served as a gunnery instructor at Kingman Army Airfield in Arizona before joining the 398th Bomb Group as a waist gunner, described the systematic nature of American gunnery training. We taught gunners to think of their .50 caliber as a precision instrument, not a bullet hose. We emphasized the mathematics of deflection shooting. A fighter approaching at 400 miles per hour requires significant lead angle. Fire where the fighter is and you'll miss. Fire where the fighter will be in 1.2 seconds and you'll hit. We drilled this constantly. We also taught fire discipline. A gunner who empties his ammunition in the first 30 seconds of an engagement is useless for the remaining hours of the mission. We taught sustained, aimed fire, conserving ammunition for multiple engagements while maintaining effectiveness. The results of this systematic training became apparent in combat statistics. American gunners claimed thousands of German fighter victories during the war, though many claims were duplicated as multiple gunners often fired at the same target. But even accounting for overclaiming, German records confirm that American defensive fire caused significant and increasing fighter losses throughout 1943 and 1944. The social dynamics within bomber crews created additional defensive advantages that German planners hadn't anticipated. American bomber crews trained together for months before entering combat, developing tight bonds and intricate coordination. These crews lived together, trained together, and faced death together, creating unit cohesion that manifested as extraordinary defensive discipline under fire. Lieutenant James Phelan, a B-17 pilot with the 92nd Bomb Group, described how crew cohesion translated into defensive effectiveness. My crew flew 31 missions together. By our 15th mission, we functioned almost telepathically. My engineer would call out fighter positions before they entered effective range. My gunners coordinated their fire without verbal communication, one tracking a fighter through approach while another prepared to engage during the breakaway. My bombardier would assist with forward defense while simultaneously preparing for the bomb run. This cohesion couldn't be taught formally. It emerged from shared danger, mutual trust, and hundreds of hours training together. German pilots were attacking not just individual bombers but integrated teams of 10 men who trusted each other absolutely and fought as a single organism. This crew cohesion also manifested in formation discipline. Pilots maintained position despite flak damage, engine failures, and fighter attacks because they knew falling out of formation meant death for their entire crew. Gunners continued fighting despite wounds because they knew their crew's survival depended on maintaining defensive fire. The social bonds within crews created a form of mutual accountability, reinforced the formation discipline that made the defensive system effective. Major Hans Philipp, a Luftwaffe ace with 206 victories who was killed in combat in October 1943, observed this crew cohesion during a pre-mission briefing captured in unit records. The American crews have something we lack. They fight not as individual warriors, seeking personal glory, but as teams protecting each other. Their gunners don't compete for victories. They coordinate fire to ensure their bomber survives. Their pilots don't break formation to pursue individual tactical advantages. They hold position to protect the formation. This collective mentality makes their defensive system far more effective than the sum of its individual components. The technological sophistication of American bombers provided additional defensive advantages beyond sheer firepower. The B-17 and B-24 were remarkably resilient aircraft, capable of absorbing tremendous damage and continuing flight. This resilience meant that German fighters often had to press attacks longer and more aggressively to achieve bomber kills, exposing themselves to more defensive fire. The B-17's structural design incorporated redundancy that allowed the aircraft to survive damage that would have destroyed most other bombers. Wings could lose large sections and still generate sufficient lift. Control surfaces could be partially destroyed and still provide adequate control. Engines could be shot out, and the remaining engines could maintain formation speed. Hydraulic systems had backup systems. Electrical systems had redundant wiring. This redundancy was engineered specifically to maximize combat survivability. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the Memphis Belle, described the B-17's resilience after completing his 25th mission. My aircraft took flak damage on almost every mission. We had holes in wings, fuselage, vertical stabilizer. We flew multiple missions, with 2 engines, once with only 3 engines functioning properly. The aircraft's ability to absorb punishment and continue flying meant we could maintain formation discipline even when badly damaged. German pilots often expressed surprise at how much damage our bombers could sustain and still reach home. This resilience wasn't accidental. It was the result of careful engineering that prioritized survivability over performance. We were slower than we could have been with lighter construction, but we survived encounters that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. The psychological impact of this resilience on German pilots was significant. Attacking a bomber, seeing strikes register, watching pieces fly off, and then watching the bomber maintain formation despite visible damage created a sense of futility. German pilots described emptying their ammunition into bombers and watching them continue flying, requiring multiple attack runs to achieve a single kill while exposing themselves to defensive fire repeatedly. The evolution of German attack tactics in response to American formations revealed both German tactical creativity and the fundamental limitations German pilots faced. Recognizing that standard rear quarter attacks resulted in unacceptable losses, experienced German fighter leaders developed alternative approaches designed to reduce exposure to defensive fire. The head-on attack, pioneered primarily by Major Egon Meyer and Lieutenant Colonel Georg Peter Eder, attempted to reduce the time German fighters spent under fire by approaching from directly ahead of the formation. This tactic reduced exposure time to approximately 8 to 12 seconds instead of 30 to 40 seconds for rear attacks. Head-on attacks also targeted the bomber's weakest defensive arc initially, before chin turrets were added and exploited the psychological impact of closing speeds that approached 600 miles per hour. Meyer achieved significant success with this tactic, destroying multiple bombers using head-on approaches before his death in March 1944. But head-on attacks required exceptional nerve and precise gunnery. The closing speed meant German pilots had less than 2 seconds to aim and fire effectively. A slight miscalculation meant a collision that killed both the German pilot and the American crew. Most pilots lacked the skill and nerve to execute head-on attacks effectively, and those who did found the Americans quickly adapted by adding forward-firing defensive positions. Oberst Walter Dahl, commanding Jagdgeschwader 300, experimented with mass formation attacks, where entire Gruppen of 40 to 60 fighters would attack simultaneously from multiple angles, hoping to overwhelm defensive fire through sheer numbers. These attacks occasionally achieved devastating results, destroying multiple bombers in a single pass, but they required extensive coordination, consumed enormous fuel reserves, and exposed dozens of fighters to defensive fire simultaneously. The loss rates in mass attacks often exceeded 30% per mission, making the tactic unsustainable despite occasional tactical successes. Some Luftwaffe units attempted standoff attacks using air-to-air rockets and heavy cannon, engaging formations from ranges beyond effective defensive fire. The Werfer Granit 21 rocket system, mounted on Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 4-190 fighters, could engage bombers from 1,200 to 1,800 meters, theoretically beyond the effective range of 50 caliber defensive fire. But rocket accuracy at these ranges proved abysmal. German pilots estimated that achieving a hit required firing 6 to 8 rockets, and most fighters carried only 4. The rockets' slow velocity and visible smoke trails also gave bomber pilots warning to take evasive action, further reducing accuracy. Heavy cannon installations, including 30mm and even 50mm guns, offered improved standoff capability but significantly degraded fighter performance. The added weight and drag reduced speed and maneuverability, making the heavily armed fighters vulnerable to American escort fighters when they eventually arrived in force. Every tactical innovation German pilots developed met systematic American countermeasures, creating a cycle of adaptation that German training and industrial capacity couldn't sustain indefinitely. Major Gunther Roll, who survived the war with 275 victories, reflected on this tactical evolution. We were innovating constantly, trying new attack angles, new weapon systems, new coordination methods. But the Americans adapted to each innovation faster than we could implement the next one. They had the resources to experiment, the industrial capacity to implement changes across hundreds of bombers, and the training pipeline to ensure every crew understood new defensive techniques. We had individual creativity, but lacked the systemic capacity to match their methodical improvements. By late 1943, it became clear we were losing not because we lacked courage or skill, but because we were fighting an enemy who approached warfare as an engineering problem to be solved, rather than a test of warrior spirit. The industrial dimension of the air war revealed why German pilots feared American formations with a dread that transcended tactical considerations. Every German pilot understood that behind each American bomber formation stood an industrial system capable of replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. This wasn't merely a matter of production numbers, though those were staggering enough. It represented a fundamental difference in how the two nations approached modern warfare. The United States produced 16,296 B-17 Flying Fortresses and 18,482 B-24 Liberators during the war. These weren't handcrafted machines built by skilled artisans. These were products of assembly lines that operated with mechanical precision, producing completed bombers every 63 minutes at peak production. German pilots knew that shooting down a B-17 meant nothing strategically, because 3 more would appear to replace it within days. The psychological impact of facing an apparently infinite supply of enemies created a unique form of combat fatigue. Lieutenant Franz Stigler, who achieved 28 victories and would later become famous for escorting a badly damaged B-17 to safety, described the psychological burden in post-war interviews. Early in the war, each victory felt meaningful. We were reducing the enemy's strength, contributing to eventual victory. But against the Americans, victories felt hollow. You would shoot down bombers one day, and the next day more formations would appear, larger than before, as if your previous efforts had accomplished nothing. This created a sense of futility that was more demoralizing than the danger itself. We weren't winning. We were merely delaying an inevitable defeat, buying time with our lives for a cause that grew more hopeless each month. The training pipeline that fed American bomber crews created a similar psychological impact. German pilots knew that killing an American crew meant nothing strategically, because the American training system would produce replacements faster than Germany could shoot them down. By 1943, the United States Army Air Forces operated the largest aviation training program in human history, graduating thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners monthly. The scale of American training operations defied German comprehension. The AAF operated hundreds of training bases across the United States, Canada, and other allied nations. These bases consumed resources on a scale that would have bankrupted most nations. Fuel for training flights, ammunition for gunnery practice, aircraft for training missions, instructors, maintenance personnel, administrative staff. The entire apparatus represented an investment in air power that Germany couldn't hope to match. Major Wilhelm Hergé, who achieved 73 victories on the Western Front, documented his growing realization of American industrial superiority in letters captured after his death in December 1944. "We are not fighting American pilots. We are fighting American factories, American training schools, American fuel production, American everything. For every bomber we destroy, they build 3 more. For every crew we kill, they train 5 more. This is not warfare as we understood it. This is industrial genocide, the systematic application of overwhelming material superiority to grind down an opponent regardless of skill or courage. We cannot win this war through superior tactics or individual heroism. Those advantages mean nothing against an enemy who can simply outlast us through sheer production capacity." The fuel situation created an additional dimension of psychological pressure. By mid-1943, Germany faced increasing fuel shortages that restricted training flights, limited combat operations, and forced difficult choices about resource allocation. German fighter pilots watched their training hours decrease, while American pilots arrived in Europe with 400 to 500 hours of flight time, including extensive combat simulation and gunnery practice. Unteroffizier Heinrich Setz, a replacement pilot who joined Jagdgeschwader 52 in August 1943 with just 130 hours total flight time, described the terror of facing American formations with inadequate preparation. "My instructors told me I needed another 50 hours minimum before combat operations. But fuel shortages meant training was cut short. I was assigned to an operational unit having never fired my guns at a moving target, never experienced high-altitude flight above 6,000 meters, never practiced the specific attack profiles required against heavy bombers. My first combat mission against American bombers, I froze during the attack run. The concentration of defensive fire was beyond anything my training had prepared me for. I broke away without firing, returned to base in shame, and spent the night vomiting from fear and adrenaline. Veterans told me this was normal, that everyone experienced terror on their first mission against American formations. But many pilots never survived long enough to overcome that initial terror. The quality gap between American and German pilots reversed dramatically between 1940 and 1944, creating another dimension of German psychological burden. Early war German pilots had been superbly trained, receiving 250 to 300 hours of flight training before joining operational units. These pilots dominated European skies through superior training, combat experience, and aircraft performance. But the attrition of 3 years of combat operations, combined with fuel shortages that restricted training, created a crisis in pilot quality by late 1943. Germany was losing experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them, and replacement pilots arrived with inadequate preparation. The result was a two-tiered force where a small number of experienced aces accounted for the majority of victories, while replacement pilots died in alarming numbers during their first few missions. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff documented this crisis in unit records from Jagdgeschwader 7-7. We received 12 replacement pilots in October 1943. Within 2 weeks, 6 were dead, 3 were wounded seriously enough to be removed from combat status, and 2 had been transferred after suffering nervous breakdowns. Only 1 survived his first month of operations. These weren't cowards or incompetents. These were young men who had been thrust into combat with training that would have been adequate in 1940, but was completely insufficient for the tactical environment of late 1943. The Americans arrived with extensive training and immediately joined formations where experienced crews mentored them. Our replacements arrived inadequately trained and were immediately thrown against the most dangerous targets imaginable, mass formations of heavy bombers defended by hundreds of machine guns. The psychological impact of watching inadequately trained comrades die created additional stress for surviving veterans. Experienced pilots felt responsible for protecting inexperienced wingmen, but the tactical environment often made this protection impossible. Veterans described the guilt of surviving when younger pilots died, the frustration of losing wingmen who might have become skilled pilots given adequate training, and the growing certainty that Germany was losing the air war through systemic disadvantages that individual courage couldn't overcome. The strategic impact of losing air superiority over Germany itself created the final dimension of psychological trauma for Luftwaffe pilots. For 3 years, German pilots had fought over enemy territory or neutral ground. They had protected German cities from attack, maintained the myth of invincibility that sustained civilian morale, and embodied the regime's promise of protection. But by early 1944, American formations penetrated deep into Germany regularly, bombing targets while German fighters struggled to inflict meaningful casualties. The sight of enemy bombers over Berlin, Munich, and other German cities, protected by formations that German fighters couldn't effectively counter, destroyed the psychological foundation of Luftwaffe fighter pilots' identity. They existed to protect Germany from aerial attack, yet they were increasingly powerless to fulfill this mission. Major Heinz Bahr described the crushing psychological burden after a mission over Berlin in March 1944. We intercepted a formation of approximately 200 bombers escorted by fighters over our capital. Our group attacked repeatedly, losing 6 aircraft while shooting down 3 bombers confirmed. We landed to discover the bombers had destroyed an aircraft factory we were supposed to protect. Civilians who watched our efforts asked why we couldn't stop the bombers. What could we say? That we lacked the numbers, the fuel, the training pipeline, the industrial capacity to effectively defend Germany? That each mission felt like suicide while accomplishing nothing strategically? That we watched comrades die daily for tactical victories that meant nothing in the broader context of industrial warfare? We said nothing. We simply saluted and returned to our quarters, knowing tomorrow would bring another formation we couldn't stop. Contrast with RAF night operations became even more pointed as the war progressed. German night fighters continued achieving tactical successes against RAF Bomber Command throughout 1944, maintaining loss rates that occasionally forced the British to suspend operations against specific targets. But these tactical successes had no strategic impact because they couldn't prevent the systematic destruction of German cities. Meanwhile, American daylight operations continued regardless of German fighter opposition, protected by formations that absorbed punishment and continued their missions. Hauptmann Heinz Noack captured this frustration in his diary entry from May 19, 1944. Last night, our night fighters shot down 63 British bombers attacking targets in the Ruhr, a significant tactical victory that earned decorations and recognition. This morning, American formations struck multiple targets across southern Germany. We intercepted with every available aircraft, lost 19 fighters and 14 pilots, and shot down 11 bombers confirmed. The Americans continued their missions despite our attacks, dropped their bombs with devastating accuracy, and returned to England. Tonight, the British will come again. Tomorrow, the Americans will come again, and we will continue bleeding experienced pilots in tactical victories that accomplish nothing strategically. This is not warfare. This is systematic destruction of Germany's defensive capacity through industrial attrition. The psychological mechanisms that German pilots developed to cope with this reality revealed the depth of their trauma. Some pilots developed superstitious rituals, lucky charms, pre-mission routines that provided an illusion of control in an environment where survival seemed random. Others developed gallows humor, jokes about death and defeat that allowed them to discuss their fears indirectly. Many developed emotional numbing, suppressing feelings to avoid confronting the horror of their daily existence. Medical officers reported increasing alcohol abuse as pilots attempted to self-medicate the stress of repeated exposure to near-certain death. Some pilots developed elaborate rationalizations for continued fighting, claiming they fought for comrades rather than for the regime, or that their resistance bought time for some miracle weapon to change the war's trajectory. But underneath these coping mechanisms, most German pilots understood by late 1943 that they were fighting a losing war, that American industrial superiority made defeat inevitable, and that their daily missions accomplished little beyond delaying that inevitable defeat at the cost of their lives. The human cost of this realization manifested in ways that horrified Luftwaffe leadership. Suicide rates among fighter pilots increased dramatically in late 1943 and throughout 1944, though exact figures remain classified or lost. Pilots would simply fail to return from missions, and investigation would reveal they had flown into the ground or crashed without apparent cause, suggesting deliberate self-destruction rather than combat loss. Others suffered complete psychological breakdowns, unable to board aircraft or frozen in terror during missions. These men were typically evacuated to rear-area medical facilities, where they joined thousands of other psychological casualties, a hidden cost of the air war that German propaganda never acknowledged. Major Wilhelm Herget wrote privately about witnessing a respected colleague's breakdown in November 1943. Oberleutnant K., who had earned the German Cross in Gold for 67 victories, refused to board his aircraft before a mission against American bombers. He simply sat in the dispersal hut, trembling, unable to move. The squadron doctor examined him and diagnosed acute combat fatigue. Kay told me later, in tears, that he couldn't face another mission against American formations. He described nightmares where he flew endlessly through curtains of tracers, watching his aircraft disintegrate around him while more bombers appeared ahead, infinite, unstoppable. He begged to be assigned anywhere else, even the Eastern Front where combat was arguably more dangerous, because he couldn't psychologically endure another mission against American daylight formations. They sent him to a rest facility. He never returned to combat operations. A decorated ace with nearly 70 victories, destroyed not by enemy action but by the psychological burden of fighting an enemy he couldn't defeat. The contrast between the psychological impact of American daylight operations versus RAF night operations couldn't be more stark, and this contrast revealed fundamental truths about the nature of aerial warfare that German doctrine had never acknowledged. Night fighting preserved the illusion of individual agency. A skilled night fighter pilot could hunt effectively, achieve victories, feel competent and effective. The darkness concealed the broader strategic situation, allowing pilots to focus on tactical achievements. Daylight operations against American formations destroyed every comforting illusion simultaneously. German pilots could see exactly how many bombers they faced. They could watch their attacks accomplish minimal damage. They could witness comrades dying around them. They could look up and see the contrails of formations stretching across the sky, a visible representation of American industrial might. They couldn't hide from the mathematical reality that they were losing. that their efforts were futile, that each mission brought them closer to death without bringing Germany closer to victory. This complete destruction of psychological defenses, this inability to maintain any illusion of eventual success, created trauma that night operations simply didn't produce, despite being equally or more dangerous tactically. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, who commanded the Luftwaffe fighter force throughout this period, understood the psychological dimensions of the crisis, even if he couldn't solve them. His post-war memoir reflected on the fundamental difference between fighting the British at night and fighting the Americans during daylight. Against RAF Bomber Command, our pilots could maintain their self-image as warriors, hunters protecting Germany from nocturnal predators. Individual skill mattered, tactical creativity mattered, courage and aggression could produce victories. Against American daylight formations, none of these traditional warrior virtues mattered sufficiently. The Americans had systematized aerial warfare, reducing it to industrial production, mechanical formations, and mathematical probabilities. They fought not as individual warriors, but as a collective system optimized for efficiency. Our pilots, trained in the romantic tradition of aerial combat as individual duels between skilled opponents, found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't acknowledge the rules of individual combat. This psychological adjustment proved impossible for many pilots. They couldn't maintain their self-image as elite warriors, when daily experience demonstrated they were merely targets in an industrial process designed to grind them down through attrition. The final accounting of the psychological war revealed complete American victory. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only as scattered remnants, its pilots either dead, captured, or broken psychologically. The force that had terrorized Europe from 1939 through 1942 had been systematically destroyed, not primarily through tactical defeats, but through psychological attrition, the accumulated weight of fighting an enemy that couldn't be defeated through traditional warrior virtues. The American daylight bombing campaign succeeded not merely by destroying German industrial capacity, though it accomplished that objective decisively. It succeeded by creating a psychological burden that German pilots couldn't sustain, by forcing them daily to confront their irrelevance in an industrial war, by destroying every comforting illusion that had sustained them through earlier victories. German pilots feared American bomber formations more than RAF night raids, not because American operations were more dangerous tactically, the loss rates were actually comparable, but because American formations represented something German military culture couldn't psychologically process. They represented industrial democracy, the systematic application of material superiority backed by unlimited resources and methodical planning. They represented warfare stripped of romanticism, reduced to mathematics and production schedules. They represented an enemy that wouldn't engage in individual duels, wouldn't respect warrior prowess, and wouldn't acknowledge anything except the cold calculus of attrition warfare. The sight of American formations darkening the sky over Germany in their precise geometric patterns, absorbing everything German fighters could inflict, and continuing their missions regardless, broke something fundamental in German fighter pilots' psychology. It demonstrated that courage, skill, and warrior spirit meant nothing against an enemy who approached warfare as an engineering problem, to be solved through systematic application of overwhelming resources. The hunters who had terrorized Europe discovered they had become prey in an industrial slaughter they couldn't escape, fighting an enemy they couldn't intimidate, pursuing a victory they couldn't achieve. This psychological destruction proved as decisive as any tactical defeat, transforming elite warriors into traumatized survivors who understood too late that modern warfare had moved beyond individual heroism into an industrial realm where traditional military virtues had become strategically irrelevant. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.